Knotweed is the ticking time bomb that is currently exploding throughout Whatcom County. Ranked as one of the top 10 most invasive species in the world, knotweed seems intent on global domination.
We're here at Hovander Park on the Noxious River, and this is knotweed here. There's vast quantities here at Hovander Park and all along the Noxious River. And there are many names for knotweed, including false bamboo, Japanese bamboo, and botanical names include Falloppia, Rainutria. There's a lot of names, but the reality is it's all knotweed, and it's all a nasty, nasty pest plant. It's definitely having an impact on the river ecosystems, on wildlife habitat, very dramatically expanding populations. New infestations are starting constantly, and patches that are already here are spreading very dramatically. There's no bird using it that I've seen. There's no animals using it. Animals are breaking trail through it. There's elk trails busting through it. It's never getting browsed. And you look at the leaves, there's no insect damage to the leaves. Nothing's snacking on this plant. It's just not providing any resources for the wildlife.
All of these are noxious weeds, and one of their chief survival mechanisms is their ability to hide themselves and masquerade, for a while at least, as an interesting and often even pretty plant. They might even stay interesting until they start taking over your garden bed and pushing out all your expensive flowers and shrubs.
I just love this plant. It's so beautiful, and I don't have to water it hardly at all, and it spreads so nicely. Now, something this pretty just can't be noxious.
Well, that's how most of these plants, get into the wild. Water hyacinth, for example, is one of the worst aquatic weed problems in the world, and it first came into our country in the 1906 World's Fair in New Orleans, and someone brought some to their pond, and this particular plant, it floats, it maybe grows about this high, has a beautiful purple flower, but it reproduces 1,200 times a month. And as their pond filled up, they just pitched some into the Mississippi River that happened to be floating by, and now we have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres of that stuff in the United States, all through the southeast and into California. So I mean, that's a pretty good example.
Another thing you might consider is your pond or your wetland linked with any other ponds or wetlands. You can check to see if your noxious weed, well, you might think your beautiful plant, has been escaping into other nearby habitats.
In larger water bodies like this, it's really best to leave it in a natural state, because that's what our waterfowl and our animals need to keep alive. That's their food source, their nesting habitat. We need to keep in mind the bigger picture here, that we can't tweak something and not expect repercussions. And if we think that we can come in and do better in terms of what nature needs because it's convenient to us or it's aesthetically pleasing and all, we can certainly disrupt what was a natural system. And in many cases we may not be able to take it back to that natural system depending on what species are introduced.
This is a beautiful pond plant. What's wrong with making that ugly detention pond a little bit better? After all, if you love something, set it free.
That's a statement that sounds very nice. If you love something, set it free. But in the natural world, that's not an appropriate viewpoint, because setting something free, you really have no idea what the consequences of that are. You kind of have to take a slightly larger viewpoint and kind of consider, besides how you feel about that plant, what is its bigger role? What are the consequences that it has in the environment? You may be planting one little plug of plant, and it's hard to picture that one plug of plant becoming something that covers square miles, but it can happen, thereby more or less destroying those areas permanently as fish, waterfowl habitat, and as recreation areas for people.
Look, we got it from a nursery.
So it has to be okay, right?
One of the things you do need to be aware of is that there are thousands of new plants coming into the state on a daily basis. And none of these plants have gone through any kind of a screening to determine whether they are going to actually be invasive or not. So it's your job as the purchaser or the home owner to know what you're putting in your area. Be aware. Look at it. See if it might tend to have some qualities that could term it quote-unquote invasive. If it tends to spread very rapidly, have billions of seeds, just be aware of that. There are two state weed laws. There's the state noxious weed law, which has 123 noxious weeds on it, and then there's a state quarantine law. And the state's quarantine law is actually regulated by the Washington State Department of Agriculture. And this list contains 84 plants. So you can kind of do the math that there's 123 plants on the state noxious weed list, but there are only 84 plants on the quarantine list. Some of the plants that are on the state noxious weed list don't make it to the quarantine list. Part of the reason why is because with regulations, if it's on the quarantine list, the actual nursery inspectors need to go around to each of the nurseries and look for those plants and remove them. A lot of our nursery inspectors also have to look for plant diseases and insects. So if you can imagine one person going into 8,000 nurseries that we have in the state of Washington to control both the insect diseases, the plant pathogen diseases, and also the noxious weed diseases, they get a little overwhelmed. The majority of the nursery owners are actually very good at controlling what weeds or what plants they have in their nursery that could be noxious weeds, and they're really good about actually removing them from the shelves.
What we found were that all of a sudden ponding water gardening got very popular, and there was a real rush to bring plants in. So all of a sudden all of this plant material was available and nobody knew exactly what it did. And now we're finding that some of them are pretty bad. We keep pretty close tabs on the lists. We download them off the internet. We have representatives that bring them to us, so we can keep ahead and alert of what is considered noxious weed.
Come on! Everybody knows a hill is more stable with something growing on it.
The other misconception that a lot of people have is that just because there's something on the ground that it'll definitely stabilize that soil. Well, if you have plants like let's say bachelor button, which is related to the knapweeds, a lot of people have done a lot of research on the knapweeds, which show that the knapweeds themselves encourage soil erosion by like close to 40%. With plants like, let's say giant knotweed, for example, because it has fairly large roots, it actually won't stabilize the soil. What it'll do is it'll make a root mass, and that root mass will be stable, but your hillside itself actually won't be stable, and your hillside will actually slip away.
Some plants are just better suited for certain places. It's just nature's way.
In talking about the species shift, what we're really talking about is that we have native plants in the state of Washington, and there are other native animals that have grown to rely on these native plants. So when you bring in a foreign plant and you actually have it come in, it will sometimes remove the native plants. And then what happens is that as the native plants are removed, the larger animals can't actually utilize that invasive species because it has no forage value, and that means that it's just not edible and they can't gain anything really from eating it. And a lot of times when you look at a lot of our noxious weeds, they're also very prickly, so they'll take over an area and they'll make it so that a larger animal, like let's say a deer, can't move into the area and actually still browse on like the lower lying grasses because it has a prickly plant in its way. So then what ends up happening is that you end up moving the deer to an area that they're not familiar with.